1. Posidonius tells us that Marcus Claudius, who was 5 times consul of the Roman people, was the son of Marcus, and was the first of his family to receive the name of Marcellus, which means warlike. Indeed, by his experience he became a thorough soldier. His body was strong and his arm powerful. He was fond of war, and bore himself with a lordly arrogance in battle, though otherwise he was of a quiet and amiable disposition, fond of Greek culture and literature, to the extent of respecting and admiring those who knew it, though he from his want of leisure could not make such progress as he wished. For the Roman chiefs of that period were, if any men ever were, condemned in the words of Homer, from youth to age, disastrous wars to wage. In their youth they fought the Carthaginians on the Sicilian coast. In middle age they fought the Gauls in defense of Italy itself. When advanced in years they again contended with Hannibal and the Carthaginians, not as common men do, obtaining any relief from constant service because of their old age, but ever urged by their courage and nobility of soul to accept the command in new campaigns. 2. Marcellus was practiced in all forms of battle, but was especially skillful in single combat, so that he never declined any man's challenge, and slew all who challenged him. In Sicily he saved the life of his brother, Ottocilius, when in great peril, by holding his shield over him and killing his assailants. For this conduct, young as he was, he received crowns and rewards from the generals, and as he grew in reputation, was elected curule aedile by the people and augur by the priests. This is a kind of priestly office, to which the law specially assigns the observance of auguries drawn from the flight of birds. During his tenure of the office of aedile, he was obliged, much against his will, to commence a lawsuit. He had a son of his own name, in the bloom of youth, of great beauty, and equally with it admired by his countrymen for his modesty and education. Capitolinus, Marcellus's colleague, a licentious and reckless man, made disgraceful proposals to this lad. He first repelled his attacks alone, but on a second attempt told his father, and Marcellus, being much enraged, summoned the man before the Senate. He attempted many quibbles and subterfuges, and appealed to the tribunes of the people to support him. But as they refused his application, he betook himself to pleading denial of the charge. There being no witness of what he had said, the Senate decided to send for the boy, and when they saw how he blushed and wept with a modesty mingled with unquenchable rage, they, without requiring any other proof, found Capitolinus guilty, and condemned him to pay a fine, with which Marcellus had silver libation vessels made, and consecrated them to the gods. 3. After 22 years, the First Punic War came to an end, and the Romans turned their attention to Gaulish troubles. The Insubrians, a Celtic tribe dwelling in Italy at the foot of the Alps, powerful by themselves, were collecting other forces, and enrolling all those Gauls who fought for hire, called Gesatae. It was a wonderful and fortunate circumstance that this Celtic war did not break out at the same time as that with Carthage, but that the Gauls, like the gladiator who waits to fight with the survivor of a pair of combatants, had remained quiet during the whole of that war, and now stepped forward and challenged the victors when they were at leisure. Yet the war caused much terror, because it would take place on their own frontier against their neighbor states, and because of the ancient reputation of the Gauls, whom the Romans seemed to fear more than any other nation. They once lost their city at their hands, and afterwards passed a law that the priest should be exempt from all military service, except in case of another war with Gaul. Their alarm was shown both by their preparations, for it is said that never before or since were there so many thousand Romans under arms, and by their extraordinary sacrifices. For though they never observe the barbarous ceremonies of foreigners, but as far as possible are humane and like the Greeks in their religion, on the outbreak of this war they were compelled to follow certain prophecies in the Sibylline books, and bury alive 2 Greeks, a man and a woman, and likewise 2 Gauls, in the place called the Cattle Market. And in accordance with these prophecies, they still, up to this day in the month of November, perform religious mysteries, which may not be seen or spoken of by either Greeks or Gauls. 4. At the beginning of the war, the Romans were sometimes victorious and sometimes defeated, without coming to any decisive action, until the consulate of Flaminius and Furius, who led a great army against the Insubrians. Then the river that passes through Picenum ran blood, and it was said that 3 moons were seen at the city of Arminium, and the augurs who watched the omens at the consular elections declared that the appointment of these consuls was wrong and of evil omen for the people. Hereupon, the Senate immediately sent dispatches to the camp, recalling the consuls, that they might as soon as possible return and lay down their office and so undertake nothing as consuls against the enemy. Flaminius, when he received these dispatches, did not open them before he had routed the barbarians in battle and overrun their country. So when he returned to Rome loaded with spoil, the people did not go out to meet him, but because he had not at once obeyed his orders, and had treated them with insolent contempt, very nearly refused him his triumph, and after the triumph reduced him to a private station, forcing both him and his colleague to give up their office. So much regard had the Romans for religion that they would not on occasions of the greatest good fortune overlook any neglect of the prophecies and customs of their ancestors, holding it more important for the safety of the state that their generals should reverence the gods than that they should conquer the enemy. 5. As an example of this, Tiberius Sempronius, a man second to no one in Rome for courage and virtue, named as his successors when consul Scipio Nasica and Caius Marcius, and when they were actually in possession of their provinces and armies, he happened to consult a book of sacred ritual, and found in it an old custom which he did not know before. It was to this effect: when a consul has hired a house or tent outside the city to watch the flight of birds, if he be obliged before any certain omen appears to return to the city for what cause soever, he must give up the place which he hired and take another, and make his observation over again from the beginning. This, it seems, Tiberius did not know, and it was after using the same place twice that he named these men consuls. Afterwards, having discovered his error, he laid the matter before the Senate, and that body did not despise this apparently slight irregularity, but sent dispatches to the men, who at once left their provinces, returned to Rome, and resigned their office. Now this happened in later times, but in the very times of which we write, 2 men of the best family were deprived of the priesthood: Cornelius Cethegus, because he handed the entrails improperly at a sacrifice, and Quintus Sulpicius, because when he was sacrificing, the crested hat which he wore, as flamen, fell off his head, and because when Minucius the dictator was appointing Gaius Flaminius his master of the knights, the mouse which is called the coffin mouse was heard to squeak. They turned them out of their office and elected others. But those so elaborately careful in trifles they never admitted any superstitious observance, and neither altered nor added anything to their ancestral ritual. 6. When Flaminius and his colleague had resigned their offices, Marcellus was designated consul. On entering upon his office, he nominated Gnaeus Cornelius as his colleague. It was said that the Gauls were offering terms of reconciliation, and that the Senate wished for peace with them, but that Marcellus raised the spirit of the people and excited them to continue the war. But still a peace was concluded, and it seems to have been the Gesatae who renewed the war by crossing the Alps and stirring up the Insubrians. 30,000 in number, they joined that tribe, which was many times larger, and in high spirits at once attacked Acere, a city beyond the river Po. From that place, Britomartis with 10,000 Gesatae proceeded to plunder the country near the Po. Marcellus, hearing this, left his colleague before Acere with the infantry, heavy baggage, and 1/3 of the cavalry, and himself, with the rest of the cavalry and about 600 of the most active foot soldiers, marched night and day till he fell in with the 10,000 Gesatae at Clastidium, a Gaulish village which not long before had been subject to the Romans. There was no time for rest or refreshment, for his arrival was at once perceived by the enemy, and his force despised, as he had so little infantry with him, for the Celts thought nothing of his cavalry. Admirable horsemen, and proud of their superior skill, they also had greatly the advantage of Marcellus in numbers, and at once their king, riding foremost, charged the Romans with great impetuosity and terrible threats, expecting to sweep them away. Marcellus, fearing that they might surround and outflank his small body, spread out his cavalry, thinning and widening his line until he presented a front nearly equal to that of the enemy. He was now advancing to the charge, when his horse, scared at the terrible display of the enemy, turned short round and forcibly carried him back. Marcellus, fearing that this might cause superstitious terror to the Romans, hastily wheeled his horse round on the bridle hand, and having again directed him against the enemy, paid his adorations to the sun, as though he had made this circle not by chance, but of set purpose. For the Romans have this custom of turning round to worship the gods, and so he, as he was on the point of joining battle, vowed that he would consecrate the finest of his enemy's arms to Jupiter. 7. At this moment the king of the Gauls, seeing him and conjecturing from his dress that he was the Roman leader, rode out far beyond the rest, and made directly for him, defiantly shouting a challenge and brandishing his spear. He was a man distinguished from the rest of the Gauls by his tall stature and his complete armor, which glittered like the lightning with gold and silver, and all kinds of gay devices with which it was encrusted. Marcellus, as he looked along the enemy's line, thought that these were the finest arms, and were those about which he had made his vow to Jupiter. He rushed upon the Gaul, pierced his breastplate with his spear, and by the impetus of his horse bore him to the ground alive, and with a second and third thrust killed him at once. Leaping from his horse and seizing the armor of the dead man, he said, looking up to heaven, "Jupiter, thou that seest the great deeds of generals and captains in war, I call thee to witness that I am the third Roman general that has slain the enemy's general and king by killing this man here with my own hand. And having killed him, I consecrate to thee the first and fairest of the spoils. But do thou grant us like good fortune in the rest of this war." Hereupon the Roman cavalry charged, not against cavalry by itself, but they fought against infantry and cavalry mixed together, and won a victory of an unparalleled and wonderful kind, for never before or since that day did such a body of horsemen rout such numbers of horse and foot. Having slain the greater part of them, and collected their arms and stores, he returned to his colleague, who was with difficulty holding his own against the Celts before the walls of the largest and most populous of Gaulish cities. It is called Mediolanum, and is regarded by the Cisalpine Gauls as their metropolis. Consequently, they fought vigorously in its defense, and more besieged Cornelius than were besieged by him. And when Marcellus arrived, the Gesatae, as soon as they heard of the defeat and death of their king, went home. Mediolanum fell, and the Celts of their own accord surrendered the other cities, and threw themselves upon the mercy of the Romans. They received moderate terms of peace. 8. By a decree of the Senate, Marcellus alone triumphed. His procession was glorious, as few others have been, with the splendor and value of the booty exhibited, and the great stature of the captives. But the strangest and most interesting sight of all was the general himself, as he appeared carrying the suit of armor of the Gaul to offer it to the god. He had cut and trimmed the trunk of a tall young oak tree, and had tied and hung the spoils upon it, each put in its proper place. When the procession began, he himself mounted his chariot, and carried in state through the city, this the most glorious of all his trophies of victory. The army marched after him with their finest armor, singing as they went songs and paeans of victory in honor of the gods and their leader. Thus he proceeded till he reached the temple of Jupiter. Here he dismounted and dedicated his spoils, being the third, and up to our day, the last who ever did so. First comes Romulus with the spoils of Acron and Caninem. Second, Cornelius Cossus offered the spoils of Tolumnius the Etruscan. Third, Marcellus offered these spoils of Britomartis, the king of the Gauls. After Marcellus, no man. The Roman people were so overjoyed at that victory and the end of the war that they made from the money paid to ransom captives a golden statue, and sent it to Apollo at Delphi as a thank offering, and gave a magnificent share of the booty to their allies, and even sent many presents to Hero, the king of Syracuse, their friend and ally. 9. When Hannibal invaded Italy, Marcellus was sent with an army to Sicily. But when the disaster at Cannae took place, where many thousand Romans perished and only a few fugitives collected at Canusium, it was expected that Hannibal would at once march to attack Rome, as he had cut off the greater part of the army. Marcellus at once sent a garrison of 1,500 men to guard the city, and afterwards, in obedience to a senatus consultum, went to Canusium, and taking command of the fugitives collected there, led them out of their fortified camp, to show that he would not deliver up the country to the enemy. The Romans had lost many of their most capable leaders in the wars, and Fabius Maximus, who had the greatest reputation, was blamed by them for sloth and want of enterprise because of his excessive caution in avoiding a defeat. Thinking, therefore, that he was an excellent general for defense, not for attack, they cast their eyes upon Marcellus, and in order to combine his vigor and daring with the cautious and far-seeing tactics of the other, they at one time elected them both consuls, at another made the one consul and the other serving as proconsul. Posidonius tells us that Fabius was called the shield of the state, and Marcellus the sword. And Hannibal himself said that he feared Fabius as a schoolmaster, but regarded Marcellus as an antagonist. for the former prevented his doing any mischief, while the latter might make him suffer some. 10. At first, Hannibal's soldiers, elated with their victory, roamed with careless confidence out of their camp and plundered the country, where Marcellus fell upon them, and by a series of defeats considerably weakened them. Next he went to Naples and Nola. At Naples he encouraged the citizens, who of their own accord wished well to the Roman cause, but at Nola he found the city in a state of faction, as the Senate were unable to restrain the populace, who favored Hannibal. There was one Bandius, a man of the first nobility of the city, and renowned for bravery. This man had fought at Cannae with conspicuous valor, and had slain many Carthaginians. When after the battle he was found in a heap of slain, with his body pierced with darts, Hannibal, in admiration of his courage, not only dismissed him without ransom, but gave him presents, and made him a personal friend. Bandius, out of gratitude, was one of the most eager partisans of Hannibal, and having great influence with the people, was urging them to revolt. Marcellus thought that it would be a crime to put to death a man of such glorious antecedents, and who had taken part in one of the greatest struggles of the Romans, and besides his natural kindliness, being able by his conversation to win over any man of noble nature, he on one occasion, when greeted by Bandius, inquired who he might be, though he knew very well, but merely wanted a pretext and opportunity for conversation with him. For when he answered, Lucius Bandius, Marcellus, as though surprised and pleased, said, "Are you indeed that Bandius, of whom all those who fought at Cannae told us at Rome, the only man who did not desert Paulus Emilius the consul, but who received upon his own body the greater part of the darts which were aimed at him?" Bandius admitted that he was the man, and endeavored to speak lightly of his wounds, but Marcellus went on. "Then, as you bear about you such marks of your devotion to our cause, why did you not at once come to me? Do you think us slow to requite the valor of our friends, when it is honored even by the enemy?" Having spoken to him thus courteously, he embraced him, and presented him with a war horse and 500 silver drachmas. 11. After this, Bandius became the firmest partisan and ally of Marcellus, and a terrible denouncer and assailant of the opposing party. This was a numerous one, and their design was, when the Romans should march out of the town against the enemy, to attack their baggage. Marcellus, therefore, having marshaled his troops within the city, brought the baggage to the gates, and by proclamation forbade the people of Nola to approach the walls. Thus no force was visible, and he induced Hannibal to march up to the city in disorderly array, as he supposed that within it all was confusion. Then Marcellus ordered the gate nearest him to be thrown open, and with the best equipped of his cavalry charged out of it, and fell upon the enemy hand to hand. Presently, the infantry poured out of another gate, running with loud shouts, and while Hannibal was dividing his forces to deal with them, a third gate opened, and from it issued the remainder of the army, and from all sides attacked the Carthaginians, who were bewildered at the unexpectedness of the attack, and fought without spirit against their immediate assailants, because of the others who they saw would soon beset them. There first did Hannibal's troops give way before the Romans, and were chased with great loss into their camp. It is said that more than 5,000 perished, and that no more than 500 Romans fell. But Livy does not consider that a great defeat took place, or that so many of the enemy fell, but he points out that Marcellus gained much glory by that battle, and that the Roman people took courage after their misfortunes, thinking that it was not against an unconquerable and invulnerable foe that they were fighting, but one who could be made to suffer as well as themselves. 12. For this reason, as one of the consuls was dead, the people called for Marcellus, though he was absent, to become his successor. And in spite of the efforts of the government, they put off the day of election until he came to Rome from the army. He was elected consul by the votes of all the tribes, but it thundered at the time, and as the priests declared this an unpropitious omen, but did not dare openly oppose his election for fear of the people, he himself voluntarily resigned his office. But he did not avoid military service, but was created proconsul, and returning to Nola and his army, he harassed those who had chosen the side of Hannibal. When the latter hastily marched to the assistance of his friends and offered to fight a pitched battle with Marcellus, he declined. But subsequently, when the greater part of the Carthaginian army was scattered in search of plunder, and no longer expecting an attack, he fell upon it. He had distributed long lances, such as are used on shipboard, among his infantry, and instructed them to watch their opportunity and hurl these from a distance at the Carthaginians, who had no javelin men, and whose heavy spears were only used to thrust with at close quarters. In consequence, it seems, of this, all who engaged with the Romans that day turned their backs and shamefully fled, losing 5,000 killed, 600 prisoners, while of their elephants 4 were killed and 2 taken alive. And what was of the greatest importance of all, on the 3rd day after the above battle, 300 Spanish and Numidian cavalry deserted to the Romans, a thing which never had happened to Hannibal before, as although his army was composed of so many different nations, he had been able for a very long time to inspire it with the same spirit. These men faithfully served Marcellus and the generals who succeeded him. 13. Marcellus, when elected consul for the 3rd time, sailed to Sicily, for Hannibal's successes in the war had encouraged the Carthaginians to recover that island, especially as Syracusan politics were in a disturbed state in consequence of the death of the despot Hieronymus. And on this account a Roman army under Appius had already been sent there. When Marcellus had taken the command of this army, he received a large accession of Roman soldiers, whose misfortune was as follows. Of the troops who fought with Hannibal at Cannae, some fled, and some were taken alive, in such numbers that the Romans scarcely thought that they had left sufficient citizens to man the city walls. But this remnant was so full of pride, and so great of soul, that though Hannibal offered to release the captives for a small ransom, they would not take them, but refused by a decree of the Senate, and endured to see some of them put to death, and others sold out of Italy as slaves. The mass of those who had saved themselves by flight they sent to Sicily, with orders not to set foot on the soil of Italy until the war with Hannibal was over. So when Marcellus went to Sicily, these men came in a body into his presence, and falling on the ground before him, besought him to permit them to serve as honorable soldiers, promising with cries and tears that they would prove by their actions that it was more by their bad fortune than their cowardice that the defeat at Cannae took place. Marcellus was touched with compassion, and wrote to the Senate, asking to be allowed to fill up from these men the vacancies which would occur in the ranks of his army. Much discussion followed, and at last the Senate decreed that Rome did not require the services of cowardly citizens, but if Marcellus nevertheless wished to make use of them, they must not receive any of the crowns and other awards which are commonly bestowed by generals as the prizes of valor. This decree vexed Marcellus, and after the war in Sicily, he returned to Rome and blamed the Senate that in spite of all that he had done for them, they would not allow him to relieve so many citizens from such a miserable position. 14. In Sicily at this time, he had just cause of complaint against Hippocrates, the Syracusan general, who, favoring the Carthaginian side and wishing to establish himself as despot, put to death many Romans at Leontini. Marcellus took Leontini by storm and did no harm to the inhabitants, but flogged and executed all the deserters whom he found. Hippocrates first sent to Syracuse a story that Marcellus was exterminating the people of Leontini, and when this report had thrown the city into confusion, he fell upon it and made himself master of it. Marcellus hereupon proceeded to Syracuse with his whole army, and encamping near the city, sent ambassadors to tell them what had really happened in Leontini. By this, however, he gained nothing, as the Syracusans would not listen to him, for the party of Hippocrates was in the ascendant. He now attacked the city both by sea and land, Appius commanding the land forces, while Marcellus directed a fleet of 60 quinqueremes, full of armed men and missile weapons. He raised a vast engine upon a raft made of lashing 8 ships together, and sailed with it to attack the wall, trusting to the numbers and excellence of his siege engines and to his own personal prestige. But Archimedes and his machines cared nothing for this, though he did not speak of any of these engines as being constructed by serious labor, but as the mere holiday sports of a geometrician. He would not indeed have constructed them, but at the earnest request of King Hero, who entreated him to leave the abstract for the concrete, and to bring his ideas within the comprehension of the people by embodying them in tangible forms. Eudoxus and Archytas were the first who began to treat of this renowned science of mechanics, cleverly illustrating it and proving such problems as were hard to understand by means of solid and actual instruments, as for instance both of them resorted to mechanical means to find a mean proportional, which is necessary for the solution of many other geometrical questions. This they did by the construction, from various curves and sections, of certain instruments called mesographs. Plato was much vexed at this, and inveighed against them for destroying the real excellence of geometry by making it leave the region of pure intellect and come within that of the senses, and become mixed up with bodies which require much base servile labor. So mechanics became separated from geometry, and long regarded with contempt by philosophy, was reckoned among the military arts. However, Archimedes, who was a relative and friend of Hero, wrote that with a given power he could move any given weight whatever, and as it were rejoicing in the strength of his demonstration, he is said to have declared that if he were given another world to stand upon, he could move this upon which we live. Hero wondered at this and begged him to put this theory into practice, and show him something great moved by a small force. Archimedes took a 3-masted ship, a transport in the king's navy, which had just been dragged up on land with great labor and many men. In this he placed her usual complement of men and cargo, and then, sitting at some distance without any trouble, by gently pulling with his hand the end of a system of pulleys, he dragged it towards him with as smooth and even a motion as if it were passing over the sea. The king wondered greatly at this, and perceiving the value of his arts, prevailed upon Archimedes to construct for him a number of machines, some for the attack and some for the defense of a city, of which he himself did not make use, as he spent most of his life in unwarlike and literary leisure, but now these engines were ready for use in Syracuse, and also the inventor was present to direct their working. 15. So when the Romans attacked by sea and land at once, the Syracusans were at first terrified and silent, dreading that nothing could resist such an armament. But Archimedes opened fire from his machines, throwing upon the land forces all manner of darts and great stones, with an incredible noise and violence, which no man could withstand. But those upon whom they fell were struck down in heaps, and their ranks thrown into confusion, while some of the ships were suddenly seized by iron hooks, and by a counterbalancing weight were drawn up and then plunged to the bottom. Others they caught by irons like hands or claws suspended from cranes, and first pulled them up by their bows till they stood upright upon their sterns, and then cast down into the water, or, by means of windlasses and tackles worked inside the city, dashed them against the cliffs and rocks at the base of the walls, with terrible destruction to their crews. Often was seen the fearful sight of a ship lifted out of the sea into the air, swaying and balancing about, until the men were all thrown out, or overwhelmed with stones from slings, when the empty vessel would either be dashed against the fortifications, or dropped into the sea by the claws being let go. The great engine, which Marcellus was bringing up on the raft called the harp, from some resemblance to that instrument, was, while still at a distance, struck by a stone of 10 talents weight, and then another and another, which fell with a terrible crash, breaking the platform on which the machine stood, loosening its bolts, and tearing asunder the hulks which supported it. Marcellus, despairing of success, drew off his ships as fast as possible, and sent orders to the land forces to retreat. In a council of war it was determined to make another assault by night, for they argued that the straining cords which Archimedes used to propel his missiles required a long distance to work in, and would make the shot fly over them at close quarters, and be practically useless, as they required a long stroke. But he, it appears, had long before prepared engines suited for short as well as long distances, and short darts to use in them, and from many small loopholes pierced through the wall small scorpions, as they are called, stood ready to shoot the enemy, though invisible to them. 16. When then they attacked, expecting that they would not be seen, they again encountered a storm of blows from stones, which fell perpendicularly upon their heads, and darts which were poured from all parts of the wall. They were forced to retire, and when they came within range of the larger machines, missiles were showered upon them as they retreated, destroying many men, and throwing the ships into great disorder, without their being able to retaliate. For most of the engines on the walls had been devised by Archimedes, and the Romans thought that they were fighting against gods and not men, as destruction fell upon them from invisible hands. 17. However, Marcellus escaped unhurt, and sarcastically said to his own engineers, "Are we to give in to this Briareus of a geometrician, who sits at his ease by the seashore and plays at upsetting our ships, to our lasting disgrace, and surpasses the 100-handed giant of fable by hurling so many weapons at us at once?" For indeed, all the other Syracusans were merely the limbs of Archimedes, and his mind alone directed and guided everything. All other arms were laid aside, and the city trusted to his weapons solely for defense and safety. At length Marcellus, seeing that the Romans had become so scared that if only a rope or small beam were seen over the wall, they would turn and fly, crying out that Archimedes was bringing some engine to bear upon them, ceased assaulting the place, and trusted to time alone to reduce it. Yet Archimedes had so great a mind and such immense philosophic speculations that although by inventing these engines he had acquired the glory of a more than human intellect, he would not condescend to leave behind him any writings upon the subject, regarding the whole business of mechanics and the useful arts as base and vulgar, but placed his whole study and delight in those speculations in which absolute beauty and excellence appear unhampered by the necessities of life, and argument is made to soar above its subject matter, since by the latter only bulk and outward appearance, but by the accuracy of reasoning and wondrous power can be attained. For it is impossible in the whole science of geometry to find more difficult hypotheses explained on clearer or more simple principles than in his works. Some attribute this to his natural genius. Others say that his indefatigable industry made his work seem as though it had been done without labor, though it cost much. For no man by himself could find out the solution of his problems, but as he reads he begins to think that he could have discovered it himself. By so smooth and easy a road does he lead one up to the point to be proved. One cannot therefore disbelieve the stories which are told of him, how he seemed ever bewitched by the song of some indwelling siren of his own, so as to forget to eat his food and to neglect his person, and how when dragged forcibly to the baths and perfumers, he would draw geometrical figures with the ashes on the hearth, and when his body was anointed, would trace lines on it with his finger, absolutely possessed and inspired by the joy he felt in his art. He discovered many beautiful problems, and is said to have begged his relatives and friends to place upon his tomb when he died a cylinder enclosing a sphere, and to write on it the proof of the ratio of the containing solid to the contained. 18. Such was Archimedes, who at this time rendered himself, and as far as lay in him, the city invincible. During the blockade, Marcellus took Megara, one of the most ancient of the Greek cities in Sicily, and also captured Hippocrates' camp at Aquileia, with the destruction of more than 8,000 of his men, attacking them just as they were planting the palisades of the rampart. He overran a great part of Sicily, inducing cities to revolt from Carthage, and beat all forces that opposed him. As time went on, he took prisoner one Damapus, a Spartan, as he was sailing out of the harbor of Syracuse. The Syracusans desired to ransom this man, and Marcellus, in the course of many negotiations and conferences about him, noticed that a certain tower was carelessly guarded, and that men might be introduced into it secretly, as the wall near it was easy to climb. Having, from his frequent journeys to confer with the besieged near this tower, gained a good idea of its height, he prepared scaling ladders, and waited till the Syracusans were engaged in celebrating the feast of Artemis, and given up to drinking and amusement. Not only did he gain the tower unobserved, but was able to occupy the whole circuit of wall with his troops, and to break into the hexapolon. When the Syracusans began to discover their position and muster for their defense, he ordered trumpets to sound on all sides, which produced great terror and tumult, as they imagined that no part of the walls remained untaken. Yet the strongest, and that too the largest and finest part of the city, was still left, called Acradina, because it is fortified on the side near the outer town, part of which is called Neapolis, and part Tyche. 19. These parts of the city were captured, and at daybreak Marcellus moved down through the hexapolon, amidst the congratulations of his officers. It is said that when from the high ground he surveyed that great and fair city, he burst into tears, thinking how sadly it would soon be changed in appearance when sacked by his soldiers. For none of his officers dared to oppose the soldiers when they demanded the privilege of plunder, and many encouraged them to burn and destroy. But Marcellus would not so much as entertain the idea of this, but much against his will, was forced to permit them to carry off the movable property and slaves, though he forbade them to touch freemen, and gave strict orders that none of the citizens of Syracuse should be slain, dishonored, or enslaved. Yet even after moderating their license to this extent, he thought that the city was sadly ill-treated, and even in such a moment of triumph he showed great sorrow and sympathy for it, as he saw such great wealth and comfort swept away in a few hours. For the treasure was said to be not less than that which was afterwards taken in Carthage itself. The rest of the city was taken after a short time by treachery, and the soldiers insisted upon plundering it, with the exception of the royal treasury, which was confiscated to the state. Marcellus was especially grieved at the fate of Archimedes. He was studying something by himself upon a figure which he had drawn, to which he had so utterly given up his thoughts and his sight that he did not notice the assault of the Romans and the capture of the city, and when a soldier suddenly appeared before him and ordered him to follow him into the presence of Marcellus, he refused to do so before he had finished his problem and its solution. The man hereupon in a rage drew his sword and killed him. Others say that the Roman fell upon him at once with a sword to kill him, but he, seeing him, begged him to wait for a little while, that he might not leave his theorem imperfect, and that while he was reflecting upon it he was slain. A third story is that he was carrying into Marcellus's presence his mathematical instruments, sundials, spheres, and quadrants, by which the eye might measure the magnitude of the sun. Some soldiers met with him, and supposing that there was gold in the boxes, slew him. But all agree that Marcellus was much grieved, that he turned away from his murderer as though he were an object of abhorrence to gods and men, and that he sought out his family and treated them well. 20. The Romans up to this time had given foreign nations great proofs of their skill in war and their courage in battle, but had not shown any evidences of kindness of heart, clemency, or any social virtue. Marcellus seems to have been the first who exhibited the Romans in a more amiable light to the Greeks, for he so dealt with his adversaries and treated so many individuals and cities with kindness that even if any harsh treatment did befall Enna or Megara or Syracuse, it was thought to be more by the fault of the vanquished than of the victors. 21. When the Romans recalled Marcellus to conduct the war in their own country, he removed most of the beautiful ornaments of the city of Syracuse to be admired at his triumphal procession and to adorn Rome. For at that time, Rome neither possessed nor knew of any works of art, nor had she any delicacy of taste in such matters. Filled with the blood-stained arms and spoils of barbarians, and crowded with trophies of war and memorials of triumphs, she was no pleasant or delightful spectacle, fit to feed the eyes of unwarlike and luxurious spectators. But in my opinion you might call Rome at that time, in the words of Pindar, the domain of Ares who revels in war. Wherefore Marcellus gained the greater credit with the vulgar, because he enriched the city with statues possessing the Hellenic grace and truth to nature, while Fabius Maximus was more esteemed by the elders. He neither touched nor removed anything of the kind from the city of Tarentum, which he took, but carried off all the money and other property, and let the statues remain, quoting the proverb, "Let us," said he, "leave the Tarentines their angry gods." They blamed Marcellus's proceedings as being invidious for Rome, because he had led not only men, but also gods as captives in his triumph, and also because the people, who before this were accustomed either to fight or to till the ground, and were ignorant of luxury and indolent pleasures, like the Heracles of Euripides, unpolished, rough, but skilled in useful arts, were made by Marcellus into idle babbling connoisseurs of the fine arts, and wasted the greater part of the day in talk about them. He, however, prided himself upon this even before Greeks, saying that he had taught the ignorant Romans to prize and admire the glories of Greek art. 22. Marcellus, whose enemies opposed his claim to a triumph on the ground that the campaign in Sicily was not completely finished, and that he did not deserve a third triumph, so far gave way as to lead the greater triumphal procession as far as the Alban Mount, and only to enter the city in the lesser form which the Greeks call ion, and the Romans an ovation. The general conducts this not as in the triumph, riding and a sounding before him, but walking on foot in low shoes surrounded by flute players, and crowned with myrtle, so as to look unwarlike and joyous rather than terrible. And this is a great proof to me that in old times it was the manner and not the importance of the things achieved that settled the form of triumph. Those generals who had their entry in that martial and terrible fashion, having, as is customary, in lustrations of armies, crowned the men and wreathed their arms with abundance of laurel, whereas the generals who without an appeal to arms had settled matters satisfactorily by negotiation and persuasive eloquence, were given by custom this peaceful and festive entry into the city. For the flute is a peaceful instrument, and the myrtle is the favorite plant of Aphrodite, who above all the gods hates violence and war. This form of triumph is called ovation, not from the cry of Evan, as most people think, for the other also is accompanied with shouts and songs, but the word had been twisted by the Greeks into one that has a meaning in their language, and also they are convinced that some honor is paid to Dionysus in this ceremony, which god we name Evius and Thriambos. It is curious to observe that the great Laconian lawgiver arranged the sacrifices differently to those of Rome. In Sparta, those ex-generals who have accomplished their purpose by persuasion or fraud sacrifice an ox, while those who have done it by battle offer a cock. For though warlike to excess, they thought that a victory gained by clever negotiation was greater and more befitting human beings than one gained by force and courage. Which is to be preferred, I leave to my readers' consideration. 23. When Marcellus entered upon his fourth consulship, his enemies induced the Syracusans to send a deputation to Rome to complain loudly to the Senate of the cruel and unjust treatment which they had received from him. Marcellus chanced to be performing some sacrifice in the Capitol. So when the Syracusans came to the assembled Senate, begging for a hearing, that justice might be done them, the other consul stopped them, feeling that Marcellus ought not to be attacked in his absence. But Marcellus, as soon as he heard of it, came to the Senate house, seated himself as consul on the curule chair, and dispatched business. Then when this was finished, he came down and placed himself as a private person in the place where men on their trial usually stood, and called on the Syracusans to prove their charges against him. They were abashed at his majestic confidence of demeanor, and he who had been invincible in arms seemed to them yet more terrible and unapproachable in his consular purple. Nevertheless, encouraged by the enemies of Marcellus, they began their impeachment, and pleaded their cause in a piteous fashion, their chief point being that they, who were friends and allies of the Romans, had been treated in a way in which many other generals had forborne to treat hostile cities. Marcellus answered that they had done the Romans much harm, for which they had received no punishment, except such as could not be prevented in war, because victorious soldiers cannot be restrained from sacking a town which they have won, and their city, he said, was taken because they had refused his frequent offers of terms of agreement. They could not urge that they had been forced into war by their despots, for they had themselves chosen those very despots with the intention of going to war. After both parties had been heard, the Syracusans, according to custom, left the Senate House. Marcellus came out with them, leaving his colleague to preside over the assembly, and stood outside the doors without altering his usual demeanor, either from fear of the result or anger against the Syracusans, but serenely awaiting the verdict of the Senate. When the question was voted upon, and he was announced successful, the Syracusans prostrated themselves before him, beseeching him with tears to put away his anger against themselves, and to show pity on the city, which was sensible to kindness and would be grateful to him. Marcellus was touched by their appeal. He became reconciled to them, and was a constant benefactor to their city. He restored them their freedom, their laws, and what remained of their property, and the Senate confirmed his acts. In return for this, besides many other honors, they passed a law that whatever Marcellus or any of his descendants should land in Sicily, the Syracusans should wear garlands of flowers, and hold a festival with sacrifices to the gods. 24. Next he proceeded against Hannibal, and whereas nearly all the other consuls and generals after the disaster at Cannae had thought of nothing but avoiding battles with him, and no one had dared to measure himself with him in the field, he adopted the opposite course, arguing that while they fancied that they were wearing out Hannibal's army, they did not perceive that Italy was being consumed by it. Fabius, he urged, thought too much of safety, and by his policy of waiting, Rome, already drooping under its burdens, would at the end of the war perish as well as Hannibal. He was, he said, like those timid surgeons who shrink from using decisive remedies, and who mistake the sinking strength of the patient for the abatement of disease. His first act was to take some important Samnite towns which had revolted. Here he found great stores of corn and money, and took 3,000 of Hannibal's soldiers who were there as garrison. Next, when Hannibal defeated and killed Gnaeus Fulvius, the proconsul in Apulia, with a loss of 11 military tribunes and the greater part of his army, Marcellus sent dispatches to Rome, bidding the citizens be of good courage, for he was already on the march, and would abate Hannibal's exultation. Livy tells us that these dispatches, when read, did not diminish the grief of the Romans, but added to their fear, as they reflected that the risk they were about to run was so much more serious than the defeat they had sustained, as Marcellus was superior to Fulvius. According to his dispatch, he instantly marched against Hannibal into Lucania, and finding him entrenched on some strong hills near the city of Numistro, he himself encamped in the plain. On the following day he was the first to draw out his army in battle array. Hannibal descended from his position and fought a great and well-contested battle, for it began at the 3rd hour, and was scarcely over by dark, but without any decisive result. At daybreak he again led out his army and defied Hannibal to fight, but Hannibal retired, and Marcellus, after stripping the corpses of the enemy and burying his own dead, pursued. His skill and good fortune were greatly admired in this campaign, as he did not fall into any of the numerous ambuscades which were prepared for him by Hannibal, and in all his skirmishes came off victorious. For this reason, as the comitia were impending, the Senate thought that it would be better to call the other consul away from Sicily than to recall Marcellus just as he was thoroughly engaged with Hannibal. When the other consul arrived, they bade him name Quintus Fulvius dictator. For a dictator is not chosen by the people or by the Senate, but one of the consuls or praetors comes forward publicly and names whom he pleases dictator. And this is the reason that the man so named is called dictator, for dicere in Latin means to name. But some think that the dictator is so called because he does not require any vote or show of hands, but on his own responsibility dictates his orders. Indeed, the orders of magistrates which are called by the Greeks diatagemata are called edicts by the Romans. 25. When Marcellus's colleague came to Rome from Sicily, he wished to name another person dictator, and, that he might not be forced to act against this inclination, he sailed away by night back to Sicily. Under these circumstances, the people nominated Quintus Fulvius dictator, and the Senate wrote to Marcellus bidding him vote for this person. He did so, confirming the choice of the people, and was himself elected proconsul for the following year. After a conference with Fabius Maximus, at which it was arranged that the latter should make an attempt on Tarentum, while Marcellus should constantly engage Hannibal, and so prevent his affording the town any assistance, he set out, and came upon Hannibal near Canusium. Hannibal frequently shifted his camp, and tried to avoid a battle, but Marcellus was not to be shaken off, and at length attacked his position, and by skirmishing provoked him to fight. Marcellus sustained his attack, and the battle was put an end to by night. Next morning his troops were again beheld under arms, so that Hannibal in great anxiety called together the Carthaginians and besought them to fight, as they had never done before. "You see," said he, "that even after our great victories we cannot rest in peace unless we drive away this fellow." The armies met, and Marcellus seems to have lost the day by an unreasonable maneuver. His right wing was suffering, and he ordered up one of the legions to support it. But this change produced confusion in the ranks, and gave the victory to the enemy, with a loss of 2,700 men to the Romans. Marcellus, after retiring to his fortified camp, called together his soldiers and reproached them, saying that he saw before him the arms and bodies of many Romans, but not one true Roman. They begged forgiveness, but he answered that he could not forgive them when defeated, but would forgive them if victorious. On the morrow he said that he would renew the battle, in order that the Romans might hear of their victory before they heard of their defeat. After these words he gave orders that the troops which had given way should be supplied with rations of barley instead of corn, which had such an effect upon them that although many were suffering from the hurts in the battle, yet there was not one who did not suffer more from the reproaches of Marcellus than from his wounds. 26. At daybreak, the scarlet robe, the well-known signal of battle, was displayed from the general's tent. The disgraced troops, at their own request, were placed in the first rank. The rest of the army followed under their officers. Hannibal, hearing of this, exclaimed, "Hercules, what can one do with a man who knows not how to bear either good or bad fortune? This is the only general who, when victorious, allows his foe no rest, and when defeated takes none himself. We shall always, it seems, have to be fighting this man, who is equally excited to attack by his confidence when victor, and his shame when vanquished." In the battle, the men on each side were fighting on equal terms, when Hannibal ordered his elephants to be brought into the front rank, and to attack the Roman lines. Great tumult and disturbance was produced by this, but one of the tribunes, by name Flavius, seized a standard, stood his ground, and struck the first elephant with a spiked end of the staff, till he forced him to turn back. He then attacked the next one, and those that followed. Marcellus, seeing this, ordered his cavalry to ride as fast as they could to the scene of the confusion, and complete the rout of the enemy. They charged briskly and pursued the flying Carthaginians, cutting them down up to their very camp. Great havoc was wrought by the wounded elephants among them, and in all over 8,000 are said to have perished. Of the Roman force, 3,000 were killed, and almost all the survivors were wounded, which circumstance enabled Hannibal to leave his camp by night unmolested, and remove himself from the neighborhood of Marcellus. For Marcellus could not pursue, because of the number of wounded, but marched in a leisurely manner towards Campania, and passed the summer at Sinussa, recruiting the health of his soldiers. 27. Hannibal, after he had thus torn himself free from Marcellus, sent his army to plunder Italy as recklessly as though it were disbanded, and in Rome Marcellus was ill spoken of. His enemies induced Publius Bibulus, a clever and violent partisan, to attack him. This man frequently addressed assemblies of people and urged them to transfer the command to another general, since Marcellus, he said, after a little sparring with the enemy, had gone to the hot baths to refresh himself, as if after a gymnastic contest. Marcellus, hearing of this, left the army in charge of his legates, and went to Rome to clear his reputation from these slanders. But in consequence of them, he found that he was to undergo a trial. A day was fixed. The people assembled in the Circus Flaminius. Bibulus rose and impeached him. Marcellus spoke shortly and simply in his own defense, but the highest and noblest citizens spoke at great length in his praise, calling on the people not to show themselves by their vote worse judges of war than Hannibal, who was always as eager to avoid fighting with Marcellus as he was to fight with other generals. After these speeches had been delivered, the accuser was proved to be so far wrong in his impeachment that Marcellus was not only honorably acquitted, but actually elected consul for the 5th time. 28. On assuming his office, he first put down an insurrectionary movement in Etruria by visiting the various towns and using conciliatory language. After this, he wished to consecrate a temple, which he had built out of the spoils of Sicily, to glory and valor, but being prevented by the priests on the ground that 2 gods could not be included in one temple, he began to build another one, being very much vexed at the opposition he encountered, but influenced by omens, for he was disturbed at this time by many portentous occurrences, such as several temples being struck by lightning, and the gold in the temple of Jupiter being gnawed by the mice. It was also reported that an ox had spoken with a human voice, and that a child had been born with the head of an elephant. So the priests kept him in Rome to conduct the atonements for these, though he was fretting and eager to take the field. For no man ever was so passionately desirous of anything as he was to measure himself with Hannibal in battle. His one dream by night, his only talk to his friends and colleagues, his sole prayer to the gods, was that he might meet Hannibal in a fair field. I believe that he would most willingly have enclosed both armies within a wall or palisade, and there have fought out the quarrel, had it not been that he was now loaded with honors, and had given proofs of his superiority in wisdom and conduct to any other general. Men would have said that he showed a more boyish ambition than befitted a man of his age, for he was over 60 years old when he entered upon his 5th consulship. 29. However, when he had completed the necessary sacrifices and purifications enjoined by the soothsayers, he took the field with his colleague and harassed Hannibal much in the country between the towns of Bantia and Venusia. Hannibal declined battle, but learning that a force was detached from the Roman army to attack the Locrians, he laid an ambuscade on the mountain near Petelia and defeated them with a loss of 2,500 men. This excited Marcellus, and he led his forces nearer to those of Hannibal. There was between the two camps a hill of some strength as a military post, overgrown with wood. Its sloping sides afforded a view of either camp, and upon them appeared the sources of several mountain streams. The Romans were surprised at Hannibal, that having had the first choice of so excellent a position as this, he had not occupied it, but left it to the enemy. It seems that he indeed thought it a good place to encamp in, but much better to lay an ambuscade in. And wishing to use it rather for this purpose, he filled the woods and glens with javelin men and spearmen, persuaded that the place itself would, from its excellent qualities, attract the Romans into it. Nor was he deceived in this expectation, for at once there was much talk in the Roman army about the necessity of occupying the hill, and men pointed out the advantages which would be gained over the enemy by encamping on it, or if necessary by fortifying it. Now Marcellus determined to ride forward with a few horsemen and reconnoiter it, so he sent for a soothsayer and offered sacrifice. When the first victim was slain, the soothsayer showed him that the liver had no head. On sacrificing for the second time, the head appeared of unusual size, while all the other organs were excellent, and this seemed to set at rest the fear which had been caused by the former. Yet the soothsayers said that they were even more disturbed and alarmed at this, for when after very bad and menacing victims unusually excellent ones appear, the sudden change is itself suspicious. But not fire, not walls of iron can hinder fate, as Pindar says. Marcellus rode forth with his colleague Crispinus and his son, who was military tribune, in all 220 horsemen. Of these none were Romans, they were Etruscans, with the exception of 20 men from Fregellae, who had given constant proofs of their courage and devotion to Marcellus. On the overhanging crest of the woody hill, a man, unseen by the Romans, was watching their army. He signaled to the men in ambush what was going on, so that they permitted Marcellus to ride close to them, and then suddenly burst out upon him, and surrounding his little force on all sides, struck and threw their darts, pursued such as ran away, and fought with those who stood their ground. These were the 20 Fregellans. The Etruscans at the outset ran away panic-stricken, but these men forming together defended the consuls until Crispinus, struck by 2 darts, galloped away, and Marcellus was pierced through the side with a lance. Then even the few survivors of the Fregellans left him lying there, and snatching up his son who was wounded, made their way back to the camp. The loss amounted to little over 40 killed and 5 lictors and 18 horsemen taken. Crispinus, after a few days, died of his wounds. Such a misfortune as this, losing both consuls in one battle, never before befell the Romans. 30. Hannibal heard of the fate of all the rest with indifference, but when he was told that Marcellus had fallen, he himself hastened to the place, and stood for a long time beside the corpse, admiring its strength and beauty. He made no boastful speech, and showed no joy in his countenance, as a man who had slain a troublesome and dangerous enemy, but, wondering at the strangeness of his ending, he drew the ring from the dead man's finger, and had the corpse decently attired and burned. The relics he gathered into a silver urn, upon which he placed a golden crown, and sent it to Marcellus's son. But on the way some Numidians fell in with a party who were escorting the urn, and while they tried to take it away, and the others struggled to retain it, the bones were scattered on the ground. Hannibal, on hearing of this, said, "Nothing can be done against the will of heaven." He ordered the Numidians to be punished, but took no further thought about collecting or sending away the relics of Marcellus, concluding that some god had decreed the strange death and strange lack of burial which had befallen him. This is the story related by Cornelius Nepos and Valerius Maximus, but Livy and Augustus Caesar declare that the urn was brought to his son and that it was splendidly buried. Besides his monuments at Rome, there was a gymnasium at Catana in Sicily which bore his name, and statues and votive tablets from the plunder of Syracuse were set tip in Samothrace in the Temple of the Gods, called Cabiri, and in Lindus, in Rhodes in the Temple of Athena. On his statue there these verses are written: "This monument, O stranger, doth enshrine Marcellus, of the famous Claudian line, who 7 times was consul, and in fight his country's foes o'erthrew and put to flight." For the writer of this epitaph counted his 2 proconsulates as well as his 5 consulates. His family remained one of the chief in Rome down to the time of Marcellus, the nephew of Augustus, who was the son of Octavia, Augustus's sister, and Gaius Marcellus. He died in the office at Adile while yet a bridegroom, having just married Augustus's daughter Julia. In honor of his memory, his mother Octavia established a library, and Augustus built a theater, both of which bore his name.